Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Erica Komisar, the psychoanalyst, parenting coach and author of two books, Being There, which is about the early years of a child's life, and Chicken Little, the Sky Isn't Falling, which is about adolescence and the teenage years. We started off by talking about the early years, the links between very long hours in daycare and later experience of mental illness, why it all went wrong at the Industrial Revolution, and why modern life tends to prize mothers apart from their children to the detriment of both, what practical steps families can take in order to alleviate those harms, and also the role of fathers and of other members of the family in raising children, and on the differences between instinctive maternal and paternal behaviour and why those need to be understood and cultivated. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about adolescence, how we can build resilience in adolescent children, the role of schools, homeschooling, alternative schooling, which is best for different types of children. That extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find all of our other extended episodes, the bonus episodes that I do fortnightly with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Before we start the episode, I want to briefly tell you about two things. Firstly, we'll be hosting a second Maiden Mother matchmaking event on the evening of February 19th at James Ciavarini's justly famous Il Palombe restaurant in central London. Everyone there will be there because they are looking to find a spouse. If you're interested in applying for a ticket, then head over to louiseperry.substack.com or follow the link in the show notes for more details. Secondly, many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Erica, you probably won't remember, but the first time that we met very briefly was when you did a book launch of your most recent book at the House of Parliament in London, and I brought my baby.
Yes, I do remember.
I was the one with the baby, and I thought I wouldn't normally, I felt a bit embarrassed about him being quite disruptive, but I thought if there's any book launch I can bring a baby to,
you bet
it's this book launch. So that was your second book, which is second book, is that right?
Yeah.
On adolescence. Your first book was on infants.
Yes.
And your argument, am I right, is that there are really two very important developmental windows that we need to be thinking about as parents, and also thinking about in terms of policy, because at the moment, children in both of those windows are not getting the attention that they need.
Yes, that's correct. So these two developmental windows are critical because they're the periods of development when children's brains are the most susceptible to the environment. And they're also most susceptible to change. So, the first period of development, 0 to 3, is a period of neurogenesis, which is cell growth. And by 3 years old, 85% of a child's social, emotional, or right brain is developed. And our right brain is responsible for so many important things, right? It's responsible for our ability throughout life to be able to regulate our emotions. So what we're seeing today is this sort of uptick in children and adolescents and adults who can't regulate their emotions. That's what depression and anxiety is about. It's the inability to regulate emotion. So nobody really wants to ask, where does that come from? But it comes from 0 to 3, because again, by the end of that period, 85% of the brain is developed. And so then there's this flourishing of cell growth. And then at 9 to 25 or adolescence, then the brain is pruned, like almost like a garden that's overgrown, and you prune back the bushes. And that pruning period is another susceptible period where the brain is, again, very, very sensitive to the environment. And when I say the environment is you as parents, are the people that are their caretakers, because as parents and primary attachment figures, you have the ability to help them to learn to regulate their emotions and also cope with stress. So the two really important things that happen in those periods of time are that we learn to regulate our emotions and we learn to cope with adversity or stress. That's what the brain is doing at that point.
Should we start by talking about the 0 to 3 age range? Because there is, I don't know if you've followed this much in the UK, but the place that we're at in terms of the childcare debate right now, as in sort of mainstream opinion in Westminster, is that it doesn't really matter, essentially, who looks after a child between ages 0 to 3, and that the priority ought to be maximising the ability of mothers in particular to get back into the workforce, maximising tax revenue, making childcare in the form of daycare specifically more available and cheaper to parents. And there is a sadly small contingent, all of whom have read your work and are enormous fans of you, who are kind of waving the flag for saying, no, hang on, what about all the research that we have on child development in this age range? Could you explain why that's poor policy? Why trying to funnel more very young children into full-time daycare is poor policy, not just in the short term, but also long term?
Well, economists like to talk about human capital. That's the thing for them. They like to think in numbers and economic well-being. They don't really think about human well-being, although they do talk about human capital, right? So we think about who are those people that we're putting out into the workforce, either now or in the future, and are they stable, and are they mentally well, and are they prone to breaking down, and are we creating the foundation of a healthy society when we put out children who are mentally unstable and will break down at some point? So it's very short-sighted because it's really focusing on economic development in the short term, but not really thinking about human capital in the long term, right? And that's what we do in the United States too. So, the idea that this push to get women out into the workforce as quickly as possible for the economic well-being of the country. So, of course, there is a number, and I think different studies show a different number in our country, but there's a number at which someone really needs to survive and to flourish and be happy, happy in terms of that monetary number. If you have an impoverished mother, you can't have a healthy child, which is why government has to step up and say, we will provide for those mothers. We don't in our country, and that's why I go to the UK, because your sensitivities and sensibilities are closer to my own. I try to make a difference in my own country, but I seem to have more of an influence in your country. But it's you are following suit with our country now, and that's really a shame, because that is why our mental illness numbers in children and adolescents and adults are higher than yours, because you've always done it a little differently. Now you're starting to do it like us. That means your numbers are going to go up like ours. So I think in the UK, the numbers are 1 in 7 children will end up with a mental disorder. In America, it's 1 in 5. So that should tell you shouldn't follow suit with us.
Could you explain the biochemical link here between what happens in that 0 to 3 age range and then the later risk of developing various mental illnesses?
Well, there's lots of research to show that children who form secure attachment in the first 3 years, really in the first year, 20 years later still have that secure attachment and are more likely to be mentally healthy. Now, what does that mean to be mentally healthy, right? It means that you can regulate your emotions. It means you can deal with adversity. It means you can read social cues. It means you can get along in the world socially. And so all really important functions, also things like executive functioning, judgment, perception, these are all working memory, the ability to learn. So we know that we need our right brain for our left brain to function. So think of it like the socks before the shoes. You put your socks on before your shoes. Your socks is your right brain development before your cognitive development, which is your shoes, right? So we know that it's really important to have secure attachment for later on, right, as well as in the present. What we also know from the research is that children who are insecurely attached, who have been precociously, prematurely separated from their mothers, either put in daycare or their mothers are, I could say their mothers are also physically there, but not emotionally present. Maybe they're depressed, maybe they're distracted, maybe they're angry and resentful, maybe they're absent for other reasons, mentally absent. You have to be there physically and emotionally is the truth. There is no such thing as quality time. There's no such thing as being there emotionally when you're not there physically. I always say to parents, look, you can be there, you can be there physically and not be there emotionally, but you can't be there emotionally if you're not there physically. It's just a fact, But insecure attachment has been correlated with mental illness later on in these attachment studies. So a child who's insecurely attached at 12 months is going to be insecurely attached. 80% of them are like insecurely attached 20 years later. And so these are really longitudinal research studies we have, and many of them, to show that insecurely attached children are insecurely attached 20 years later, and it's correlated to things like depression, anxiety, ADHD, and borderline personality disorder. So, and different attachment disorders. So what is an attachment disorder? Essentially, an attachment disorder is a coping mechanism. It's a strategy that a child chooses unconsciously. They don't choose it consciously, but they unconsciously choose to cope with the loss of their mother, what we call anaclitic depression. So when your mother isn't there and you're so vulnerable, then you dig deep inside your psyche to find some way to cope. The children who do best are the children with the strategy. So avoidant attachment disorder and ambivalent attachment disorder. Avoidant meaning if a mother isn't present, drops her baby at daycare. When she goes to pick that baby up, the baby goes, I don't know you. I don't want to know you. You weren't there for me. And so I'm not going to, tune into you. I'm going to have to take care of myself. And that kind of strategy leads to depression, leads to disconnection, leads to the inability to form relationships later on.
Erica, have you seen these TikTok videos? You just reminded me with this picking up the child from daycare thing. There's this minor trend of TikTok videos where parents joke about going to pick their child up from nursery, from daycare, and the daycare workers will be like, "Oh, she was a dream all day. She slept really well. She played really well. She was really well behaved." And then as soon as they get in the car, the child has a meltdown, won't behave for the parent, is acting up, is upset, is not like emotionally engaged with them. And it's kind of played for laughs in these TikTok videos because I think the joke is like, oh, what bad luck for me that they're so easy at nursery and they're so difficult at home. But then I always think, is it not possible that this is exactly what you would expect from a child who is struggling with attachment, that they would let their emotions out as soon as they get home or get in the car?
I always say to parents that children who are securely attached are better behaved children. So, the irony is that if you're not there, your children are going to be more difficult and more challenging for you. So if we're talking about from the perspective of the parent, it's going to be harder for you to raise children who are more difficult because you haven't been around. When you're around, your children are less difficult. And then parents say to me, well, I'm around, but my son still has difficulties, or my daughter still. I say, well, if you weren't around, you can't even imagine how difficult they'd be. So, everything is intensity and degree. Maybe the fact that you're around means that it's mitigated some of that difficulty for that child. You may have a very sensitive child who's very sensitive to their environment, to stress. And so that child, by being there, there's research to show that when you provide a sensitive child with sensitive empathic nurturing, it neutralizes the expression of that sensitivity and the mental illness that is correlated to that sensitivity. So, yes, a child that goes to daycare is going to be much more difficult. They're going to have behavioral problems. They're going to have sleep issues. They're going to have regression issues. They're going to show signs of aggression later on. They're going to, the studies show that children in daycare show serious signs of aggression and behavioral problems when they get to school age.
And does that tend to persist into adulthood as well? Is there a cluster of symptoms that you would characteristics that you would expect to see in an adult who had been nudged in a negative direction, I suppose, by early experience of daycare?
I mean, again, the depression and anxiety, but also things like ADHD. So ADHD is a hypervigilant response to stress. It's your brain in a vigilant state of a threat state, right? So, and that causes distractibility, because distractibility is a sign of the amygdala, the stress regulating part of the brain, on high alert. And so, ADHD, aggression, children in daycare have higher levels of salivary cortisol. So they test the children's, salivary levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and they find them to be very high. So that persistently in the brain causes things like distractibility, aggression, fight or flight. So think of fight or flight. So fight, what do we do when we're threatened? We become aggressive. We want to fight the predator, or we run. We flee from the predator, which is what distractibility is about. So, I mean, these things are not really rocket science. They're not really hard to figure out if you know what to look for. I think it's why I started writing books for parents, for lay people, because I don't need to write another book for people in my field, because we all know what it looks like. But for some reason, the public doesn't. I think some of it is an instinctual loss. It's a loss of interest in what's really happening to children underneath, and just treating them on a behavioral discipline level, and not really looking for things that intuitively we should know.
One response that you get sometimes from people when you raise this, or when I raise this as an issue, is they'll say, well, look, it wasn't as though things were always peachy in the past. We can have some kind of idealized image of the 1950s or whatever, but you had, I don't know, the British upper classes for many centuries sending their children to boarding schools or to nannies and being very emotionally distant. You had I don't know, mothers having to go and work in factories and leave. It's not as if things have always been perfect right up until a couple of decades ago. But then I suppose what we should be thinking, I mean, my response, and I wonder if you'd agree, is that we should probably be thinking in a much broader sweep of history and thinking about, hundreds of thousands of years of human development, not hundreds. And this modern phenomenon of separating infants from their mothers for very long periods of the day is very novel in terms of the whole sweep of human history, because even if it's not mothers in sole charge of their children, as in the 1950s nuclear family arrangement, even if it's shared within the kin group, mum is there. She is physically proximate to the child all the time. And it seems as if that is a very crucial thing that we are missing when we have the full-time daycare model.
So you'd have to go back to the Industrial Revolution to understand when it really went all wrong. We could say it's feminism too, but even before that, it was the Industrial Revolution, because people started going to factories, they started leaving behind their children, and also the necessity to have two incomes. You'd say the 1950s was not a perfect time, but people could live on one income. So what people are really struggling with, I went to a conference last night, like sort of the new conservatism conference, and they were talking about how the problem is that families can't live on one income anymore. So it's left this need for people to have to put their children into daycare. That's not the whole picture, because the whole picture is that it's a combination of that, plus the fact that women feel that staying home with children is not a valuable kind of work. And so, even if they possibly could get by on one income, they're choosing not to. Then you add things like materialism, and so we can't just survive in those first 3 years of our child's life. We have to have lots of stuff. We have to have bigger houses, bigger. So it's not it's a puzzle. The way I think about it is it's not simple. It's not like there was the good old days, but hopefully we want to progress and not regress. And so this uptick in mental illness is a kind of deterioration, deterioration isn't the right word I'm looking for. It's a kind of illness in society. And you could say there's many ills in society. One being that economically we've made it hard for women to even have the choice to stay home. But it's a kind of illness when our children are not doing well. It's the first sign that a society is failing, is when your children start to fail, and when your children don't want to have children. That means something is really wrong with society.
You get into this painful vicious cycle, don't you? Because it's really from the 90s, at least in the UK and America, where you see this really big uptick in middle-class women in particular working when they have young children. It's not actually from the 60s and 70s that you see this enormous rise. And that means that those children born in the 90s are now in adulthood, and some of them having their own children. But the psychological effects that we're seeing are only really coming out now. We don't have generations and generations to look at and learn from. And there's a real defensiveness around this for understandable reasons, because no parent, and I think particularly no mother, wants to think that she has done it wrong by her children. And so doubling down on whatever decision you happen to have made is a very normal and natural decision, but it does also make it very difficult to draw attention to, for instance, the links between increased use of daycare from the 90s onwards and high rates of mental illness in this generation coming up, and also to encourage anything else in policy, because it's just people just don't want to hear it.
Yeah, I suppose you could think of it a little bit differently too, that we think of generational expression of trauma. So, for instance, with the Holocaust, we see many generations after trauma like the Holocaust, many generations of traumatized children who grow into adulthood and raise traumatized children. So, and you could say trauma lives in our cells. It's passed down from generation to generation. And it changes, but it remains sort of a destructive influence generationally, right? And so if you want to think about the fact that the 60s did have, it's sort of the version of feminism. I consider myself a feminist. I have a t-shirt that says Maternal Feminism from this wonderful organization called Big Ocean Women. And I love this t-shirt. Usually I wear it on podcasts.
I'm making a note of it.
Maternal Feminism.
Big Ocean Women. Okay.
Yeah, it's a wonderful organization by a woman named Carolina Allen founded it, which is women all over the world getting together and talking about how valuable mothering is and supporting one another. Yeah. Anyway, but the idea is, I am a feminist. I benefited from feminism, but the brand of feminism, the kind of feminism that from the 60s, Gloria Steinem's feminism, is not a healthy form of feminism for our present day. It wasn't healthy then because it basically burnt down the house. They say you should never slash and burn fields. Sure, there's some fertility that comes from the earth, but it basically destroys the earth, slashing and burning crops. And so that's what it did. It slashed and burned. It said, mothering is not important. Children will be just fine. It's sort of what you hear now came from that time. Children don't matter. Mothers matter. If you don't go back into the workforce, you're not part of this feminist movement. You're a traitor to it. Get out there and get a job. That's what we're hearing today. And that was very destructive. The message should have been that not all women need to have children. Not all women want to have children. Maybe some women want to have children and also have a career. So, and there's a way to do it so you can have both, just not all at the same time. The message should have been mothering is the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, but having meaningful work is too. And maybe we can give women the opportunity to do both in their life, just not at the same time. Let's give women who have raised children the opportunity to get back into the workforce. Or let's help women who had careers before they had children to reintegrate into their careers part-time and then full-time eventually when their children get older. And, menopausal women are a force to be reckoned with. I can tell you that because I'm postmenopausal, and I can tell you that they are a force to be reckoned with because there's all of this energy that you've used to raise children. And now you're like, what do I do with it? Give me something meaningful to do. And so no one was talking about that. Instead, Gloria Steinem, who never had children, by the way, slashed and burned everything in her path and said, children don't matter. And so that's what we live with now. We live with that sentiment. We live with that gestalt that children aren't important. What's important is just women's self-determination and that women have power through money and careers. And those are all important things. But what got lost were the children and the relationship between the mothers and children, which left a lot of women with postpartum depression when they had children because they thought they wanted children, but then they had all these confused messages in their mind. And really, upon having a child, broke down and didn't know what to do with this new role, right? So I would say feminism was obviously more helpful to women than it was destructive, but it had a very destructive side to it. And we live with that today.
And one of the painful problems we have now is what Elizabeth Warren calls the two-income trap, where when it becomes normal for as you'll know, when it becomes normal for every family to have two incomes in order to buy housing in a good school district, any family who doesn't have two incomes is at a disadvantage. And so the house prices go up accordingly because people are outbidding each other. And so you end up with a situation where when it is normal to have two incomes, it is soon compulsory, essentially, economically, to have two incomes. I mean, it's not the only thing that's driving up house prices, but it is one of the factors. And you do see in the UK in particular, the point at which it's only in the 1990s that it becomes possible to apply for a mortgage with two incomes. Before then, you can only apply for a mortgage with one. And that's at exactly the point where you see this enormous uptick in house prices. There are other things happening too, but the problem with, the kind of Gloria Steinem view of it, we just give women more choice, is that it ends up actually being fewer choices, sometimes perversely, as a consequence of this kind of change, because actually most women are not Gloria Steinem. Most women want to be at home with their young children, or at least be at home with them more than they currently are. That's a very consistent finding in polling. And one perverse consequence of feminism is that they are now less able to do that than they once were.
Well, I mean, let's think about it, because we're suffering in this country from inflation. I'm guessing you are too, right? So the world, what does inflation mean? Inflation, I'm not an economist, but I've had to read enough of this that I can say that I know enough of it to say that inflation has to do with greed. Inflation has to do with an excess of material spending that leads to a rise in prices, and and so what we have now is the result of that greed. And so, to get things like housing back down, and even the price of eggs. I think the price of eggs in America is something like $9 for a dozen eggs, something crazy. I mean, if you make $12 an hour, because a lot of Americans don't even make minimum wage. If you make $12 an hour, and after taxes, that's a dozen eggs for an hour of work. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So, and if we think of it, then we say something has to change culturally. There has to be a cultural shift. So which piece shifts first, right? We can only each stay in our lane and take our own piece. And my piece is, this idea that we have lost the value. We've really lost our value system in terms of what's really important. It's when we really lose our way and we don't understand what we value most. Freud said to be mentally healthy, you need love and meaningful work. He always said love first, because without love, without family, the institution, the structure of it, the support of it, as human beings, we fall apart. So meaningful work is important. Money is important. Materialism is important, I suppose. But we've gotten the order of things wrong. But you're right. You're correct in saying 2 incomes for many families are necessary. I think what Elizabeth Warren doesn't talk about is that the word necessary is a complicated word. I think for very poor people, she's correct. But she's not really addressing the middle class in our country, at least, who have a standard in their mind of how they have to live and the TVs they have to buy and the trip to Disney World they have to take. And these aren't rich people. And they're not willing to do without that to raise healthy children. And that's the problem.
Mm-hmm. Because it means a loss of status in the here and now for the sake of who knows what in the future. Although I do think that a lot of mothers, I include myself in this, have a very painful relationship with, being present in those early years, because you feel this, the number of mothers I've heard say that when you go out without your baby, particularly when they're little, it feels like going out without a limb, that it feels like a physical pain of separation. And I think that you have to, there's such a common phenomenon of, I don't know if you've come across this, of women who work very full-time jobs and have nannies, so have, very expensive, high quality childcare, having a really ambivalent relationship with the nanny. I used to be a nanny, so I can partly talk about it from the other side of this, and often having quite, I never experienced this, but I know nannies who did experience this, receiving quite a lot of hostility from mothers and a very kind of competitive energy sometimes from mothers, because I suspect what's going on is that the mothers do actually feel not just guilt, but distress at being so physically separated from their children. And it's not too difficult. It's not good, but it's understandable that they would displace that onto the nanny, who seems to be sort of filling their place. So, I don't think it's just harm that's been done to children is what I'm saying. I think harm is done to mothers as well, because I think mothers have to endure a lot of misery, actually.
You'll appreciate this story. I started a nanny agency with 2 other therapists and a recruiter. And we decided that we were going to start an agency for sensitive, empathic, nurturing nannies, because we knew that mothers were going to go out to work, and some had to and some wanted to. But we wanted to put out nannies who were trained in sensitive, empathic nurturing, in the neuroscience research and child development and how to talk to children, how to help them to separate from and we thought this was a great idea. We designed this whole training, and we found we didn't pick every nanny, probably 1 in 3 nannies we trained. And we put out these wonderfully sensitive nannies. And we couldn't find women who really could appreciate the nanny. So after 4 years, we closed the business. And we loved the nannies, but we couldn't find mothers the mothers were mistreating the nannies. And we just couldn't take it anymore. Like we found ourselves more aligned with the nannies than the mothers. And so that's a problem as a business if you can't align with the mothers too. And the problem is, and as I see it as a therapist and in a city like New York, is that women are conflicted. They go to work because they want to, but then they feel guilty and they feel a pull, and society tells them, silence that guilt. That guilt is not healthy. That guilt is not necessary. Don't worry about your children. Again, Gloria Steinem. I always hear Gloria Steinem's voice in my head when I hear that. The problem is that guilt is a very useful feeling. It's a signal feeling. It means that you're in conflict. And so when you're in conflict, you do all kinds of destructive things. And in this case, women do what I call the revolving door of nannies. Because as soon as a nanny gets very attached to a child, as soon as a nanny says, "I love you, honey," the mother gets rigid and goes, wait a second. If I'm not going to be there with my child and have my child attached to me, then I don't want anybody else to have my child. And those are the less healthy mothers. The healthier mothers see the nanny loving the baby, see the nanny as not a threat, see the nanny as an alternative attachment figure, like a grandmother, like a hired grandmother, and say, "This is wonderful, this is what we want." So, but the less healthy, more conflicted mothers will fire nannies as soon as the babies start to depend on those nannies. So those babies are really screwed, because those babies keep experiencing not only loss of mother, but now loss of every attachment figure that comes into their life. And I've seen families where they've gone through 5 and 6 nannies before that child is 5 years old. So that child never can form those healthy attachments.
You've reminded me of a former nanny I used to know, I met when I was doing other work with the family, who said in a previous job she'd had a difficult nanny employer who had banned her from wearing perfume because the mum said she didn't like coming home to find her children smelling like the nanny.
That's right.
Yeah, sounds familiar, right? And you can
It's like an affair. It's like your child
it's
having
like
an
an
affair
affair.
with
Yeah.
somebody. Yeah.
It really does. That's what it reminded me of.
It
She told
does.
me at the
Yeah.
time. And now as a mother, I do kind of get where the mum is coming from. I think that's a horrible way to behave as an employer. But that feeling of, it is almost like romantic jealousy, feeling that you are being displaced in your child's affections. And I think that, as you say, the message is, this is, the mum guilt needs to be suppressed, or indeed that the mum guilt is just a kind of artifact of an old-fashioned culture that we need to be rid of, not a biological message that your mind is sending to you, because there is a kind of misalignment between what you're doing and what you want to be doing.
So the original title of my book, Being There, was The Lost Instinct. And that was the title. I really wanted that title, but the publisher said, "That's too scientific." And I said, "What's scientific about the word instinct?" But that is what is happening. And it is generationally kind of contributed to. And so, the reason that the 90s there was an uptick is because generationally, that is, let's say a generation is 20 years. That's 2 generations from the feminist movement, the old feminist movement. I still think there's room for a new feminist movement, and I think that's what you write about. But the idea that 2 generations from women basically dropping their children, just dropping them, it has an impact, and the impact isn't often seen right away. Sometimes it's not seen for a generation. And so now we see multiple generations, 3 generations, almost going on 4 generations, where we're seeing, children break down. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah. What is your, I want to talk about fathers in a moment, because you're so interested in fathers as well. But before we do, there will be parents listening to this who think, my goodness, I feel dreadful. Like I am stuck. I'm thinking particularly, places with sky high house prices, where you really, like, subsisting without 2 incomes is very hard. Parents thinking, it is basically a choice between me dropping out, or mothers thinking it's a choice really between me dropping out of the workforce and us having to move to the other side of the country, or me remaining in work and using paid childcare of some kind. How would you sort of rank the different options in terms of the ideal of having mum at home, supported by a loving social network with grandparents nearby and so on? That's probably the best, down to 60 hours a week in daycare. if people are having to make practical decisions somewhere in the middle, what would you say they should be trying to prioritize?
Well, that's if the world were binary. If the world were binary, I suppose if we see it that way, you're either supporting your children financially or you're supporting them emotionally. And that's just not a good choice. Like we say with what's happening in the world right now in the Middle East, there just aren't any good choices. But there are some better choices that are in between, which we need to talk about, I think, as a society, which is that women in other parts of the world work. I go to India because my husband has a foundation. We go quite often because the base of it is in India, but we travel all to Africa and India. So I have the opportunity to see different cultures, and what I can say is that women often have to work in other countries. They don't leave their children behind, and this is what the Industrial Revolution started, which is the idea that to have meaningful work, we must leave our children behind. And we know from COVID that's not necessarily so, that you can create entrepreneurial work, you can do part-time work. There are ways when you're raising young children to be creative. And I think women have a great capacity to be nonlinear and to be entrepreneurial if given the chance, if given the support. The idea of creating a kind of work that you can do part-time from home. When I go to India, women have stores. It's sort of like you had said to me, you came to my book launch carrying your baby. I think the Prime Minister of New Zealand brought her baby to Parliament. I mean, we have to get used to children being part of society, not left behind when it comes to work. Sure, there are certain kinds of work you can't bring your baby with. You can't, if you're a surgeon, you're not going to bring your baby into the surgery gallery, right? But a lot of work we can. And a lot of work we can do from home, or we can, and if a baby cries in the background, we don't judge it. We don't create such a rigid binary society around work. We say, look, a woman is a mother and is also working. And therefore, you may hear a baby cry in the background, or, and so I think there's something in between, which is you don't necessarily have to do completely without income. I also think that we have fed women a lot of false myths about meaningful work. There are kinds of work that you can have more control and more flexibility over, and you can do part-time. And then there's other work that demands that you be in the office, separated from your children, and you do it more than full-time. And I would say we need to really educate women who are already in the workforce, but also young women, that there are many different kinds of work, some of which we used to call women's work, which got denigrated and put in a pile of, ooh, who would want to do that? But meanwhile, it's wonderful work. It's helping work. It's work that you can do nursing, teaching, speech therapy, being a psychotherapist, any service profession at all, making cakes for parties, doing invitations. I mean, any service-oriented profession which you can have control over is far better for women than working in a corporate environment, because a corporate environment does not give women the control and flexibility they need to prioritize their children. So I'm not sure that binary kind of working or not working has to really be a thing. I mean, again, you go to India and you see in the little stores, you see children around their mother's feet while their mothers are selling rice. You go out into the fields in Africa and you see mothers and babies in the fields together, mothers digging up their yams and babies there playing with their mothers. I don't think it has to be so binary as we've made it.
I wrote my first book while my son was sleeping, basically. But I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest, because it meant that I had zero downtime.
I was going to say, you didn't get to sleep then. Yeah.
No, exactly.
Right.
So I mean, in an ideal world, I suppose we would have other parental figures who are permanently in a child's life, like aunts, older siblings, grandparents. Yeah. Maternal grandmothers in particular, right, are often very important in children's development and always have been historically. if you do have to use some paid childcare, what would you say is the least harmful way of doing that in terms of how many hours per week, what kind of childcare, we are agreed that the full-time daycare model is a bad one.
Yeah.
Are there kinds of paid childcare which you'd say are preferable from the child's perspective?
So what's interesting is, yes, there are. Kinship bonds are best, meaning grandparents, aunts, uncles, spouses. It's the best because they have a more similar investment in a child emotionally as the mother. But the reality is that this deterioration of family bonds is generationally passed down, and at this point, grandmothers don't want to care for their grandchildren, or they can't. So let's say maybe they have to work too, but a lot of them aren't interested. It's really interesting. So grandmothers would have relished the idea of caring for their grandchildren, but today there's many grandmothers who say, I don't want to do that. I don't want that kind of dependency on me. I mean, so we've really deteriorated our essential bonds to one another. And so, yes, I think there's still a lot of healthy grandparents out there and aunts and uncles who, particularly if governments support mothers with some monies, that money could be given to grandparents. I advocate for that in the UK and in America. Family stipends where you can give it to a kinship bond, where you could give it to an aunt or a grandmother or a babysitter. One single babysitter. Or if you're really poor, you share a babysitter with another family. That would still reduce the ratio of adult to child, and it would give more consistency. And you'd be able to have a more personal relationship with that babysitter, that nanny, right? So that would be better. So in order of appearance, I suppose the mother is best. Next would be a spouse or kinship bonds, extended family. Then would be a single surrogate caregiver like a nanny. And then sharing a caregiver if you can't afford it, but definitely no daycare.
Even part-time. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Let's talk about spouses and fathers, because one of the things that I've learnt from reading you is how differently maternal and paternal instincts manifest themselves, and it's quite funny to read. And I like read bits out to my husband as well, because you, as a parent, you read it and you see yourself, and you're like, oh wow, yeah, you're right. I do that. And like for instance, I find as a mother that all the caring, soothing is so instinctive, so easy. Whereas playing, I'm not really that good at playing. I kind of have to like think about playing. Whereas my husband just comes up with the most like inventive games so readily. And I have learned from reading your work and others that that's not a coincidence, that there are instinctive differences between us. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.